الحمد لله رب العالمين صلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh, and welcome to Islamic Oasis Live. Dear brothers and sisters, there is a lot going on in the Muslim world. Politically, there is war, there is a genocide taking place as we speak. Gaza is busy trying to deal with the Israeli problem. Iran situation is hot. The whole region, Pakistan and Balochistan situation, the Muslims in India, the Kashmir situation, as you know, there's a new issue coming up with Kashmir also as we speak. So the Muslim world is trying to get hold of its realities. What is the way forward? The Ummah is trying in every possible way to figure out it's a way to get out of the shackles that it has been put in for the last 100 years almost, since 1924. And of course, with the situation the way it is, the Islamic Ummah has always given birth to sons and daughters that have come up with different solutions, looking at the problems that they exist, the problems that exist within the Muslim Ummah. Whether it's the loss of the Khilafah, whether it's the loss of leadership in general, answering intellectual and political thoughts of the kuffar, or plots and plans of the kuffar in general, and many different discussions that are taking place across the Muslim world, across the Muslim Ummah in general. Today we have a unique scholar that is usually it's rare, dear brothers and sisters, to be able to discuss the kind of discussion that we're going to have today. And that discussion we have is with Dr. Ovamir Anjum. Many of you know him. He's appeared in many shows, different podcasts. He's an author. And just his background, Dr. Ovamir Anjum is the Imam Khattab Indoor Chair of Islamic Studies at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Toledo. His works focuses on the nexus of theology, ethics, politics, and law in Islam, with comparative interest in Western thought. He studied fiqh with South Asian Hanafi and Ahl Hadith scholars, and usul fiqh and qira'ah of the Quran with scholars from Egypt, in Al-Azhar, and in Sham, in Syria. He is the author of Politics, Law, and Community in Islamic Thought, the Ibn Taymiyyah Moment, which we have here. Inshallah, I'm sure we are going to go into this book in some way or the other. He's the founder and head researcher of Ummatics Institute, a research organization for the study of Ummatic thought and practice, which aims to empower Muslims towards the realization of unified Islamic civilizations for the benefit of the Ummah and the humanity at large. Dr. Ovamir, welcome to Islamic Oasis Live.
Very much. Jazakumullah khairan.
Sheikh, obviously there's a lot to discuss. There's a lot going on in the Muslim world. A lot that is related to the kind of work that you are doing. And I'm sure maybe some of the things that are taking place in the Muslim world were the reasons that inspired you to think about even the concept of what is now Ummatics. If you can, Sheikh, before we get into the ideas itself and the thought processes, what is Ummatics and why the need for it today?
No. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, Allahumma laka alhamdu laka shukru wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. So first of all, thank you very much for having me on this program, and thank you for your patience in persisting. It's been a busy time and a very heavy time for all believers, I understand, and listening to each other and reminding each other of the ilm, as well as the need for amal. That is the right thing to do. So may Allah bless you and increase you in both worlds.
Ameen.
Ummatics, of course, the word comes from the ummah, anything that pertains to the ummah. And the way I came to this word and concept is as I studied the idea of siyasa in Islam and the idea of politics in the West, and before the appearance of Rasulullah ﷺ in 7th century Arabia, you had these traditions of thinking about these issues going back centuries, and the formative influence on both the West as well as the Islamic civilization is a result of these two strands of thought, two streams. One is prophetic thought that is coming from Ibrahim alayhi salam and Musa and Isa, that's found in the Bible and then in the Quran. It's culminated and perfected in the Quran. That's one stream of thought. And the other stream of thought is the rational philosophical stream that has, of course, a long genealogy, but it came to maturation in Athens in Greece. And then this Greek thought is where a lot of these concepts came into both Islam and Christianity, and then Islam as in its final manifestation. Of course, Islam is the original deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and which is why when you look at some of the ulama who look at even the influence, anything that is good in other civilizations or traditions, they recognize that there must be originally from the wahi, some remnant or leftover of wahi. This is, of course, Imam Ghazali says in his book about anything about ethics or other thoughts that is good, that agrees. It's possible that its source is either the wahi or the fitrah that Allah has placed in human beings. That being the case, the idea of political thought emerges in Greece. And what is political? The word political is to think not about the individual, not about my family and clan only, but to think about a bigger whole. To think about the welfare and the interests of something bigger than me and my family. That idea, political, comes from the Greek word polis, which means the city or the city community. So political is to think about the welfare of the city, welfare of the polis, of the whole. Now, as I started reflecting on Islamic scholarship and not only the Quran and the Sunnah, but our great tradition of political reflection, the central recognition that came from that is when the great ulama of Islam and when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when they speak, they don't speak of a city community, they don't speak of national boundaries, they don't speak of an ethnic community. They are speaking of the believers, the community of the believers, no matter where they are. And that is the ummah, right? So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses the believers in the Quran and gives them the mandate, gives them, if you will, what we might call this constitution, the purpose and function that forms this community. وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. Thus we have made you the best community, the most just community. وَكُنْتُمْ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ. You are the best of communities, best of the ummahs. The word that is the key word that's used here is the ummah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is addressing the ummah. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the leader of an ummah, not the leader of a state or a city or a polis, right? And similarly, the ulama, when they write al-ahkam al-sultaniya or al-siyasa al-shar'iyya, they are not talking about a nation state, they are talking about the ummah. And so that's what the word ummatics means, that it is to remind us that when we think about politics, we should think about the ummah, not any particular nation state, any particular city, any particular region that is defined by anything, some secular criterion. Like, people who are defined in France by their Frenchness, their history, their civilization, their mythology. And, other people may be defined by their tribal lineage, true or mythological tribal lineage. So all of these things become secondary in the ummah, because what defines the ummah is the two testimonies, La ilaha illallah and Muhammadur Rasulullah. And so this becomes the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the idea then is that this is a unique community for which there is not even a word in English. There is no word in English that captures the word ummah. It's defined by a belief as well as a sacred history of prophets, culminating in the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that's why in the Quran, when it speaks of this is inna hadhihi ummatukum ummatan wahida wa ana rabbukum fa'budun. This ummah of yours is one ummah, and I am your Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm your Lord, worship me alone. So this is the community. Now, if you look at this ayah appears twice in the Quran. Both times Allah is addressing other prophets, and then finally culminating in the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which means that this is a community that extends in time all the way back to Adam alayhi salam, and then in space it is inclusive of all the believers. Anyone who says La ilaha illallah and is a believer, whichever their prophet is. They become part of this ummah until the end of time. So that is the ummatic thought, is to think about politics, but think in terms of the welfare of the ummah, the interests of the ummah, the collective responsibility of the ummah, the defense of the ummah, the prosperity and flourishing of the ummah. The effect of this is that instead, when we go to political science, when we go to international relations departments, whether in the Western world or in the derived Muslim countries, in secular universities or even Islamic universities, the unit of analysis is the nation state, the territorially defined nation state. So you may be a Muslim and you may say, Egypt is a nation state, Syria is a nation state, Sudan is a nation state, Pakistan is a nation state. Each one has their own laws and their own sovereignty. And yes, they happen to be Muslim. When you think of the problem this way, you have already, accepted terms that are impossible to Islamicize. The problems that come out of that wrong framing cannot be resolved by just adding some ayat or adding some slogans. You have to go back and fundamentally rethink our basis of belonging, and that is our belonging to the ummah. So that, if you will, is a long answer to your question.
No, there's a lot there, and there's a lot to unpack. But Sheikh, to follow up with the answer, is there you're defining politics. I think there's a lag. Can you
hear you?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because on the screen you're still speaking.
Yes, there is a lag. I see on one of my screens. I have two images of myself. One is synchronous, and the other is slightly behind.
So it's just fine. Let's continue. So, Sheikh, here's the thing. You talked about politics. You're even defining politics. But why is it, Sheikh, that a lot of scholars shy away from defining this term, this term specifically? And for the longest time, it was something that was not supposed to be spoken about in the masajid and institutions. So you are coming from both, obviously from Ibn Taymiyyah background, and you're also coming from studying from the Hanafi schools with their scholars. What did you think when you think about, when you're discussing politics or when you're defining it and when you're writing this book, what were the major hurdles that you had to go through to define, this concept to the scholarship or to the scholarly class?
So let me say something about how I came to this problem then. One of my earliest books that inspired me to think about these problems was by a Hanafi scholar, Manazir Ahsan Gilani. Is called Imam Abu Hanifa Ki Siyasi Zindagi.
Yes, Urdu mein, yes, I've read it. Yeah.
Right, the political life of Imam Abu Hanifa,
yes.
Which really intrigued me, and it introduced me. And I was very young at the time. I think I was like, between 10 and 13 years old. And since then, I have been interested in the question of politics. At that time, I didn't understand some of it, and then I went back and read my grandfather's library. And I was always fascinated by Imam Abu Hanifa's personality, rahimahullah. And in particular, his opposition, of course, as you know, he was born in the Umayyad period in the 80s and died in the year 150, and in the Abbasid period. And he struggled against both the Umayyads and the Abbasids, although he was young under the Umayyads, relatively, he would have been, or rather, I should say, he took on teaching in Kufa at a time when the Umayyads, lasted only for another maybe 10, 12 years. So during this time, he was very critical of the Umayyads, and he participated, or rather, I should say, he supported the rebellion of Imam Zayd ibn Ali, of course, from whom the Zaydi group of Shia come later as they develop. But Imam Zayd, of course, is an Imam of Ahl al-Bayt. And then later, in the year 145, 5 years before he died in the Abbasid prison, he supported another major rebellion, which was the last major rebellion. Because after that, all the rebellions became regional. This is called the rebellion of Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Nafs al-Zakiyah, the pure soul. Now, in both of these rebellions, what was Imam Abu Hanifa after? He was after a proper Islamic government, against the usurpation of power, against the corruption of power, against misuse of power. We don't have, I should say, as an historian, we don't have many details, and there are conflicting accounts. So we have to reconstruct, and we don't have a book by Imam Abu Hanifa, for instance, on what exactly the reasons were. So you have to study the community of fuqaha of which he was a part, and the debate, and so on and so forth, in order to reconstruct this account. And I have not seen a more recent scholarly treatment of this, and this is one of my dreams, is to write that book about historically rigorous book about the exact what we can determine about the trajectory of Imam Abu Hanifa. But nevertheless, we know that he died in prison, and we know that he had been presented, at least these are some reports that say he was presented the office of the Qadi by the Abbasids while Mansur, and he rejected that. In some reports, he even said that if you ask me to count the pillars of this masjid, I will not do so for you. So the idea is that he had a very strong political sense that the rulers need to be legitimate and the rulers need to be held accountable. Now, in his time, he was not alone. There were many ulama. It is said that many of the fuqaha, as well as hadith scholars, the muhaddithun of Iraq, participated in many rebellions. The rebellion of Abdurrahman ibn al-Ash'ath in the 80s, and then the rebellion of Zayd ibn Ali was a little more limited, but then the rebellion of Nafs al-Zakiyah, which was both in the Hijaz as well as in the Iraq. None of these rebellions succeeded ultimately, but this not only Imam Abu Hanifa, but many of the fuqaha who were tabi'un and taba'a tabi'in, as well as some of the Sahaba participated in them. So we know that early Muslims had a very strong, very keen sense of justice and legitimacy of the ruler. That the ruler must be. So the reasons for those rebellions are different, and I don't have time to go into it. But the lesson we can generally draw is that the ulama saw it as their duty to critique, to evaluate political rulership, and to take them to account. And that was an inspiring, if you will, legacy for me. Then later, as I studied more and I discovered, history was my favorite subject, even though I did other things as well. And when I read, Imam Mawardi's Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, its predecessors, Al-Baqillani's work, Al-Baghdadi's work, but Ghazali al-Juwayni's
You're
work.
also a physicist, I heard.
Right, that was my bachelor's degree, was in physics. So in Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, as you know, which is the subject of my book, he comes from a very different tradition. He comes from the Ahlul Athari tradition, which sees rebellion against the ruler as impermissible. And yet, at the same time, when you say that armed rebellion is impermissible, it nevertheless holds the ruler accountable, must be upheld, the hudud must be upheld, the Muslims must be defended, there must be justice. And when that is not the case, they do not permit rebellion, but they nevertheless uphold the right, in fact, the duty to do al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy al-munkar, to hold the ruler accountable. And Imam Ibn Taymiyyah himself died in prison because he refused to accept certain constraints on. He was imprisoned at least 3 times in his life, and he even in again. So he comes from a different tradition, but he shares with Imam Abu Hanifa this honor of dying in prison. And our ummah has this, I believe, a censor of truth, such that if you look at all the imams that have been accepted and that have been honored as the imams that large number of people follow, all of them showed their independence from the rulers, and many of them suffered at the hands of the rulers, which is not to say that rulers are always bad, but when rulers are bad, you stand up to them. And when they are good, they're open to nasiha, they're open to correction, then you fearlessly correct them.
Now here, Sheikh, when we say that the Athari school, they are not, let's say, they don't have the idea of khuruj is not something that is common in, at least in the Athari school. Does that, when they speak about this, they're talking about legitimate rulers that were legitimately given bay'ah to, and they took power, meaning out of bay'ah al-in'iqad, not imposed rulers or canonial setups. Sheikh, is this, am I right when I'm saying this? Or because a lot of times, we see that some of the brothers who may follow that school of thought, which is obviously a legitimate school of thought, but are they getting this right, Sheikh? Are they actually getting Ibn Taymiyyah right? Are they even getting the understanding of these ahadith regarding, doing rebellion against the hukam right?
Yeah. So an excellent question. And you're absolutely right. In fact, most people do not see the transition that is taking place from the early period to the middle period and then to late middle period. And the doctrine is changing, although people don't realize. They say that, it's always been the same. The hadith says it simply, and it's always the same. We know that is not the case for a fact, because we know that none of the Sahaba, right, when they are trying to prevent Hussein radiallahu anhu ardah from going out to Kufa, cite any of these hadith. They don't even say it's haram to go out. They're giving him pragmatic reasons. They're saying don't go because these people are not trustworthy. They're not saying don't do khuruj against Yazid. They're because it's haram. They're saying because it is not advisable. Right? So
I think Abdullah ibn Abbas is advice to Hussein. I think it was. It could have been Abdullah ibn Umar.
He advises against it, but he doesn't say it's haram. He says don't do it.
Right.
Ibn Umar says don't do it. Right? On Abdullah ibn Zubayr, according to two traditions, in one tradition he supports him. In the other tradition he says don't go. He doesn't say don't rebel. He says don't go. In one tradition. So the point is that, and then we look at the conduct of the many of the other Sahaba, as well as the Tabi'un and Taba' Tabi'in, so much so that people, it is said that none of the Fuqaha of Kufa stayed back. None of the Ahl al-Hadith of Kufa and Fuqaha of Kufa stayed back in the rebellion of Abdurrahman ibn al-Ash'ath. So my point is simply that even if this is an exaggeration, we know for a fact that many of the greatest ulama and salaf, that all of the schools of thought, all the madhahib of fiqh, except these rulers, these imams as our imams, all of them have participated in some rebellion in this period, and then the prohibition opinion becomes stronger later, even in the time of Abu Hanifa. As you all, I'm sure, know that this is one of the bones of contention between Ahlul Athar in Syria, who are very much they're pro-Umayyad and they're against rebellion, and then Ahlul Hadith in Iraq, as well as the Fuqaha of Iraq, who are pro rebellion. So these, basically, to make a long story short, among the ulama of Islam, there are three opinions. One is that khuruj al-hakim is prohibited, except if you see kufr bawah, clear kufr, and they base that on hadith in Sahih Muslim. Then there is the opinion that khuruj al-hakim rebellion against armed rebellion. We're just talking about armed rebellion. We're not talking about protesting or criticizing or doing amr and nahi. All of this is very common, and nobody historically has said that this is haram. We're only talking about armed rebellion. So armed rebellion, the second school is that armed rebellion is prohibited. Sorry, it's permissible if it's feasible, meaning that if you expect bloodshed, then don't do it. But if there is more benefit than harm, and then there is a third school that it is permissible. Now, the difference between the third and second school is tricky because feasibility is always a subjective matter. It's not a fiqhi matter. It's a matter of your political assessment. Which is why when you look at Abu Hanifa, normally people say that Imam Abu Hanifa allowed it only under certain conditions. But if you look at the two rebellions that he directly supported and praised and financially supported, both failed. He also supported other rebellions. And he supported other rebellions in the East, about which less is known. In most of these cases, those rebellions were not successful. So basically, you cannot say that he believed that you can only participate in them under some strict condition. Of course, whenever you go to war, you want to make sure that you go to only those wars that there's more benefit than harm. That goes without saying, right? Nobody says in the fuqaha of Islam that you should throw yourself into destruction and cause harm and bloodshed. The point simply is that these two opinions are hard to distinguish. Regardless, however, now going back to your question of what are the conditions of this legitimate ruler against whom rebellion is prohibited. If you look at the early ulama and fuqaha, you look at, for example, any early references, some of the actual sayings of Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik, Abu Hanifa, even Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He's largely known as anti-rebellion, the most pietist, but even he has one opinion which some ulama say seems to give permission to rebel. Because as you know, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he always has multiple opinions on a matter. So, but when they are talking about don't rebel, and when they are talking about who the legitimate ruler is, they mean a ruler who qualifies as a Khalifa in some respect, who has legitimacy. Now, historical reality was that rebellions occurred and the usurpers came to power. And when usurpers came to power, you had a split. Well, should we accept somebody who came to power through usurpation by overthrowing a just ruler, or not? But by the time you get to the middle classical period, if you will, you look at al-Baqillani, for example, the great Ash'ari scholar, the leader of the Ash'ari school, or his formative scholar. And after that, al-Juwayni and al-Mawardi al-Juwayni and then al-Ghazali, you find that their opinion on rebellion is nuanced, especially al-Juwayni, who says that if the ruler is, and I have an article on this that's available on the internet, political metaphors of an 11th century jurist, in which I talk about al-Ghiyathi al-Ummam fi al-Ghiyath al-Dhulam, in which Imam al-Juwayni says that if the ruler is engaged in sins, personal sins, wickedness, fisq, then that is not good enough reason to rebel. so long as he's applying the hudud and protecting the borders and protecting the lives of Muslims and their honor. But if he goes to a point where injustice and opposition to the Sharia becomes the norm, and he's supporting the bad guys against the good guys, and fasad is widespread, corruption is widespread in society, in that case, the rebellion is permissible. And he even goes on to say that you should not shy away from, because there will be some bloodshed. But the fasad or the evil that comes from having a ruler like that is greater. So he even goes on to basically say that you should evaluate this. But when it becomes clear that the evil is spread, then rebellion is permissible. Then you have, of course, this new opinion, which was there from the beginning, but was one might say a minority opinion, that by these 3rd, 4th century, it is becoming more and more widespread until it becomes the mainstream opinion. So much so that Imam al-Nawawi says, and nobody is above an error. So he was one of the greatest scholars of Islam, but Imam al-Nawawi says that there is now ijma on this opinion that it is impermissible to rebel against a ruler. Now, of course, most of the rulers in Imam al-Nawawi's time were not properly speaking imams or legitimate imams. Many of them were usurpers, but they were applying the Sharia and the hudud, and they were protecting the border. So they fulfilled those requirements, but they did not fulfill the formal requirements. So I divide the requirements of the khilaf for khilafah or imama into 2 categories. One is what we might call pragmatic requirements, meaning they should deliver certain goods. What are those goods? Protect the ummah and apply the Sharia. And then there are formal requirements, meaning that you should be elected by Ahl al-Ikhtiyar, Ahl al-Hall wal-Aqd, you should have bay'ah, and you should be, even in fact, according to the Sunni theory, even they should be from Quraysh. So these are formal requirements, right? And they should have knowledge. Some ulama say you should be able to make ijtihad. Some say that maybe at least you should have probity in religion and character and so on. So the ulama require pragmatic requirement always. There's no question about that until the modern period. But on formal requirements, they basically relinquish those. Now, later you begin to see that usurpation is now listed as a method of how to come to power, because it becomes so common in later Muslim history. Which is why, to finally answer your question, when late medieval ulama say that you obey the ruler and do not do khuruj, armed rebellion, they are referring to any ruler that fulfills the pragmatic requirement, meaning they're protecting the borders, keeping law and order, and applying the Sharia and the hudud. If a ruler did not do that, then that ruler would not be considered Muslim, and then that becomes a different discussion, because then it falls under the question of وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ, and so on and so forth. And then the debate becomes at what point they leave the fold of Islam and so on. But in Islamic history, we don't have an example or any extensive examples of people or rulers in that category, except under the the Mongols, when the Mongols briefly did not apply Sharia. So that's why it was an exceptional time, and that is when Ibn Taymiyyah famously gave the fatwa that the Mongols If they are Muslim, they should be fought like the Khawarij because they're not applying the Sharia. Basically, this was not an exceptional opinion. This was an opinion shared broadly by the ulama and the fuqaha of the period.
Sheikh, you talked about the authority of the Ummah. Let me just go back a little bit. This was from in the beginning of the discussion here. The Muslims. You actually talk about this also in your book, and the transition from the Khilafah to Mulkiyah, let's say. How did this affect the authority of the Ummah? Because it almost seems since from the time of the Abbasid or the Bani Umayyah or even the Uthmani Khilafah that families were running the show in many ways. They did a good job. That's not the criticism here. It's just that the Ummah, it seems that in such for the longest time the Ummah is not involved in the development of the Islamic State. It's not involved in its it doesn't grow in its thought processes. I guess as an Ummah, the authority is not there. It's just few people who are running the show. Do you think, Sheikh, did that affect in why the condition, when you see the condition of the Muslims today, that they are, for the last 100 years at least, that they have accepted anyone as their rulers because the authority was lost for the meaning their role in the Islamic State itself?
Yes, so you could say that my book is an account of how to understand that because it's a complicated matter. One of the reasons is that when you go from, you think about the question of participation. There is a lot that we often, that is hidden behind this question. We have the idea of the people. We have an idea, the people that deliberate, they have a public sphere where they come together and maybe they vote, they decide who's the best, they decide on a constitution, and then the ruler is chosen, and that ruler rules by the constitution. This assumes that there is one people, but that's not the case. You have many different groups. First of all, early Islam, for example, majority of people are non-Muslim. So when we talk about the shura in early Islam, we're talking about shura among Muslims, and especially shura among Ahl al-Shura, meaning people who know something about both the deen and governance, al-hukum. So among the elite Sahaba, that's what the Shura was in the time of the Rashidun, the ideal moment, right? It wasn't that all the people that were conquered, for example, the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh, people didn't go and ask every dhimmi, right? But you thought about the ruler. So clearly, there are practical. Why? It was not possible. In fact, elections and large-scale plebiscite or opinion polling was not possible until the modern period, until modern means of communication and transportation became available. And it was actually very dangerous. If you delayed appointing a ruler, you might invite an attack. Especially in the Rashidun period, basically this is, you are in the middle of a war, succession may look very differently than in times of peace. So by the time we got to the time of peace, right, you had the Umayyads. And the Umayyads came into, again, I have to think about as an historian rather than about right and wrong. So if you're thinking as basically political, if you're doing a political analysis of the Umayyads, if half of the people in your lands have just rebelled against you and they hate your guts, you cannot, and they don't have any tradition, any institutions to mediate disagreement, then you cannot go to them and ask for their opinion on these matters. They have been subdued, and many of these rebellions keep popping up. So you could say that there are moments in which you can measure what was done and evaluate, and that's what I try to do in my book. And one, of course, you could see, for example, when Muawiyah radiallahu anh appoints his son Yazid, who commits acts that are some of the most horrific acts in our history, not because they were more barbaric than ever before, but because they were done against the most blessed people. Against, of course, Imam Hussein, Karbala, and then the people of Medina at Al-Harra. These were, one is the most blessed family and one is the most blessed place. Both of them happened in the time of Yazid. Now, Abu Muawiyah radiallahu anhu's reasoning for that, as far as historians can tell, and the ulama of Islam do say, like Ibn Khaldun and others, that there was a good political reason for that in his calculation, that Syria needed to maintain its power, otherwise there's going to be another civil war. However, both politically and one might say from the perspective of Islamic expectations, it turned out to be a disaster. And Shura, of course, did Muawiyah do Shura? Yes, he did Shura, but his Shura was with his few favorite people that he trusted. So the question, when people often say that, we do Shura, the question is, who are you going to do Shura with? Because Shura is consultation. It's not a political institution that has defined criteria that, such and such people should always be included, and this is the number, and this is where they come from. No, Shura is an individual practice of consultation. Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh tried to give it an institutional form by saying, you have this committee of 6 people, and this is how you choose among them. You could say that was the birth of an institution, but it was the opinion of Umar ibn al-Khattab. It was not something that was binding upon all people.
You mean the forming of those 8 or 9 people to say you have 3 days to choose the Khalifa amongst you?
Committee of 6, yes, exactly.
That's a mubah.
Exactly. So it was the opinion, ijtihad of Umar ibn al-Khattab, and radiallahu anhum ajma'in. And so the point is that as the Islamic community grew rapidly, and the growth is truly astoundingly fast. The Prophet ﷺ ruled over, in Medina, ruled over a small town. And of course, that town is expanding, and its influence is expanding, but, he is not covering the day-to-day affairs of even the Hijaz, anything outside Medina, let alone entire Arabia. But then in the time of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, as we know, Ridda wars happen, and then they're brought back under control. So now governance really expands quickly. But these are not ordinary times. This is war. And in times of war, you don't build institutions or normal institutions, right? So you could say that in war and conquest continues until the time of Uthman. It only stops with the Shahada, the martyrdom of Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anh. And after that time, Muslims are split. So my point is that if you look at the early events, you realize that on the one hand, we have certain basic fundamental directives of what is the ummah, what is the goal of this community, what are the laws of this community. On the other hand, there were many political matters that are not considered, that are not finalized. Only some guidance is given about them. And so when the Umayyads come to power, they bring stability. And even that stability that Muawiyah radiallahu anh brings proves to be somewhat, one might say, transient, because it goes away with Yazid. There is the second civil war, second fitna for 10 years. And then after that, with Marwan ibn Abdul Malik, there is much longer stability. And this is why the Sahaba and the Tabi'een sometimes either like, or most of them just tolerate the Umayyads. Why? Because the Umayyads bring stability, even despite their faults. So what are their faults? The faults are that they, and some of them that you pointed out, that they are not the most pious and scrupulous in their politics, that they are, that they, instead of continuing with the example, the Sunnah of Umar ibn al-Khattab, and institutionalizing the Shura, they give up on Shura altogether. And, or not altogether, but they limit the Shura to the Umayyad family.
But the Shura, I mean, obviously it has groundings in Islamic law. Shura bainahum, it's there. But you're saying the appointment, let's say, I just wanted to correct myself here, and just to make sure I understand what you're saying. The Shura, it's an institution because there is an ayah, there is a dalil for it. Shura bainahum. But it's the issue of how many people you select to do Shura is an mubah matter.
Exactly. So it is not. It's not an institution until it has a form. So it's a matter of technical definition. You don't have an institution until you can repeat it from generation to generation in the same way. Otherwise, it's a virtue. I'm supposed to have shura just like I'm supposed to have taqwa, just like I'm supposed to be kind and merciful. But my mercy does not have an institution unless you tell me that you have to be merciful by, for example, giving 2/3 of your wealth to charity. Then you can say, okay, now this is something that can be repeated in the same form. So that's what I'm trying. When I'm trying to say the shura is not an institution, I'm saying there is not one single form, which means that they could very easily say, yes, I'm doing shura. I'm doing shura with the family, with Banu Umayyah.
But taking, I mean, can you take it by force, Sheikh?
Yes, so that's the question. If you usurp,
I mean,
so
is
that's
it any more even shura if it's taken by force?
So now you're talking about, so there are two things, if you will. Let's separate them. There's a question of governance by shura, and there's a question of coming to power by shura. The coming to power by shura, that is something that's well established, but the point becomes who's shura, especially when there is a civil war. So when there is war, and all of these normal time procedures are become difficult to implement unless there is an institution. The idea of the shura was there in the early centuries. In fact, it's a very interesting little known fact that the son of Yazid, his name was Muawiyah. So when Yazid died, Muawiyah, his son, who was a pious and a sickly man, he wasn't well and he was very pious. So he went out to people, his family, the Umayyads in Syria, in Damascus, which is what their headquarter was. And he said, I make the matter shura again, meaning let the Muslims decide who the next person is going to be. Now, of course, he died and nobody paid attention to him because that does not solve the problem. When people have their swords out, unless you have an institution that will enforce this shura, it will be meaningless. So that's why at that time, when this happened, of course, Al-Hussein had tried to rebel, and then he was martyred. And after that, Abdullah ibn Zubayr rebelled in Mecca, radiallahu anhu. And then some people, in fact, among the Umayyads even said, let us accept the Khilafah of Abdullah ibn Zubayr. And Abdullah ibn Zubayr did shura. But of course, he was a candidate, but he ruled by shura to the extent he could. Nevertheless, and he ruled for 10 years, and many ulama say that he was the rightful Khalifa at that time. But the point is that he could not hold it together for reasons we can't go into. And then the Malik ibn Marwan, the Umayyads, came back to power. So my point is that when you look at this history carefully, you realize that ruling by shura remains an ideal, but it becomes difficult to implement because of the size of the Muslim community, because of the civil war. Right? Those two reasons: size and diversity of the community, and because of civil war. And you see the best example of rule, which is why some of the ulama considered the best example of rule is the example of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. Why? Because in his time, all of the problems were present, and yet he was able to establish, even for a very short period of time, 2.5 years, establish Islamic rule and Islamic expectations again. He was able to bring back the norms of Islamic governance that made him, his time was like the time of the Rashidun. However, and this is a very interesting story which I give in my book as well, which shows the question that you're asking. So Khawarij, right? Khawarij were the Shura people. They are the ones who wanted ordinary Muslims to be empowered in this respect most. But they had other problems. Khawarij were, they had an army ready, and instead of fighting, because most of the early caliphs of Khulafa just fought them, but Umar ibn Abdul Aziz says, come and argue with me, because he was confident in his legitimacy, in his knowledge, in his taqwa, and he wanted anybody who wants to talk to me about deen, come talk to me. So 3 of them came and argued with him. And they asked a number of questions. He was able to answer them all. And so now they're convinced. The Khawarij, who had brought an army, and there were many, right? So there were occasionally there were these rebellions, but these people were convinced. However, the last question they asked Umar ibn Khattab, this is a report in Al-Tabari, the last question they asked Umar ibn Abdul Aziz is, okay, we recognize is a pious man who deserves this. But what about after you? Now Umar radiallahu an, or rahimahullah, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, was, he had, the Khalifa after him was already chosen by Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik, who died before him. He had appointed 2 rulers. One was Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, and the next one was Hisham ibn Abdul Malik. Sorry, not Hisham, al-Walid ibn Abdul Malik. So, Omar said, I can't do anything about it because the pledge has already been taken on the ruler that will come after me. So the Khariji says, suppose that you have the trust of of an orphan's property. Could you make a deal with a third party, not the orphan, somebody else, and give that to someone else? Do you have the right to make a deal? You're only a trustee. It's not your property. You can't give it to whoever you want, right? So when they make this argument to Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, Umar falls silent. So this is the only question that he doesn't have an answer to, because he realizes what they have just said. That this Khilafah did not belong to Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik, and it belonged to the Ummah. It is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so it could not be given to whomever the trustee wants. It has to be given to the one whom the orphan, in this case the Ummah, wants, right? This is the qiyas they're using. So Umar says, give me 3. That is, give me 3 days. And he's poisoned in those, according to this story, he's poisoned in those 3 days and dies a couple days later. So the point is to say that your question is valid, but the challenges are also tremendous. Now, what happens then after this of course, this is the Umayyad period, and the Abbasids come. They also, their number one weakness, number one challenge is that they never figure out an Islamic way to succession. They never figure out how, after the Rashidun, right, you never figure out a way to give power to the pious among the people. Until then, basically, Khilafah becomes hereditary among the Abbasids, even though the Abbasids lose power. But basically, you could say the ulama of the ummah make a compromise, and this is what I argue in my book, that in the 3rd century with Ahmad bin Hanbal, rahimahullah, there is a compromise. He doesn't fight a corrupt ruler like Abu Hanifa had recommended. And not only Abu Hanifa, I'm not talking about difference of schools here. I'm talking about difference of eras, because Abu Hanifa, most fuqaha were with Abu Hanifa. But at the time, the 3rd century, Ahmad bin Hanbal, basically they saw that one rebellion, the rebellion of the Abbasids, succeeded in the year 132 of Hijrah. But what came after that rebellion was even worse than the Umayyads. I mean, the Abbasids, in some respects, were worse than the Umayyads. They were more distant from the deen. And in their time, in their height, at the height of the Umayyads, their practices were very inegalitarian, very much a copy of Persian imperialism. So much so that, if an ordinary person went and visited an Abbasid Khalifa, first of all, you don't get to visit a Khalifa. It's something that only some great dignitaries could. And anybody who visited the Khalifa would be sitting up there at very great height. His face would be covered, and people literally made sajda before the Khalifa. These were practices of the Persian court that were imported into the Abbasid realm for a little while. And then, as they lost power, they came back to Islam. But the point is simply to say that the ulama are looking at all this, and they gave up the idea of imposing shura and through rebellion or through even demanding change, because you could say the ulama, and another thing that's happening is the ulama now are able to guide the society directly in such a way that the relative power of the ruler and the relative ability of the ruler to influence society is limited compared to the power of the ulama, which is increasing. So that's where the madhahib become much more powerful, much more influential in guiding Muslim life. And this was, you could say, an institutional solution to the problem of a great empire.
Again,
so this is
wow. There's quite a few things here. Now, before I really want to ask you about madhahib. Let me ask you this, but there's another question here. But madhahib, do you think, Sheikh, that for instance, the Hanafi school, for the length of the Islamic Ummah after the, let's say, after the Khulafa Rashidun, has been in political power? Is that because, is this what you're describing here, that when the Hanafi school it was the school of the Ottomanis, it was the school in a lot of, it was the school, let's say, amongst, in the Abbasid era, it was also the school at the end of the Bani Umayyah era. Is that because it takes power in a sense that it's now directing the masses rather than the political power itself, meaning the Khalifa?
No. So first of all, the Hanafi school came to power when Imam Abu Yusuf was appointed.
Yes, of course.
By by the Abbasid Khalifa. So that's not in the Umayyad period. In the Umayyad period, they were persecuted even by the early Abbasids. But once the Abu Yusuf becomes the judge of Baghdad, you could say that they have influence in the capital, but you cannot say that the Abbasids became Hanafis. Not at all, because Egypt and remained Maliki and then Shafi'i, and then each region had their own thing. It was not standard, but wherever there were Hanafis, especially in the east. So west was Maliki and Shafi'i, in the east, meaning Persia and Turks, were tended to be Hanafi. And that was organic growth. It wasn't imposed on them. Nobody had any interest in or the power to impose a madhab. But once those communities grew in the east, and partly the reason for that, I discussed this elsewhere. Abu Hanifa himself is Persian. His teacher Hamad is Persian, and they were very sensitive to the needs of non-Arabs. Which the other ulama may not have been as much, especially on the issue of irja. I discussed this in a long article, which I don't have time to go into. But the point is that there were reasons why the Hanafi school was favored by the Persians and the Turks and Central Asians. And once that becomes established, then the Abbasids send the qadis that will be accepted by the local population. And so they send Hanafi qadis. If they send, there is one case, for example, when they send a Hanafi qadi to Egypt, nobody listens to him because he has a different madhab. So they have to pull him back, and they send a Maliki qadi. So the point is that this idea that the Khalifas are imposing, and so the Khalifas may be bad in some respects, but the institution that they are governing with, the application of the Sharia and the courts, they are working according to now increasingly the logic of the knowledge that has been left by the companions, right? The taught by the Prophet ﷺ and left by the companions. And that knowledge is in different places organized according to different schools that acquire these names. So the school of Iraq becomes the Hanafi school. The school of Medina becomes the Maliki school, right? The school of Egypt, and school of Imam Shafi'i, which is a synthetic school, and becomes the Shafi'i school. The school of Baghdad becomes the Hanbali school, and so on. So I see the madahib as an organic growth, and I see them as a great development in Islamic history by which Sharia could thrive. And then as these madahib became organized, independent of power, by the way. So the Hanafi school is formed, by the time Abu Yusuf, right, becomes a Khalifa, becomes a Qadi, you have the foundations of the Hanafi school, even though it's not a full-fledged school yet. But read Abu Yusuf's Kitab al-Kharaj, for example, like the book of taxation, which is effectively the book of politics, because the main task of the Khalifa is how to get taxes and how to spend them. In Kitab al-Kharaj, Imam Abu Yusuf is very far from a sycophant who is just praising the Khalifa and saying, you tell me what to do and I will do it. Rather, he is saying that a good Khalifa has to follow the sunnah of not only the Prophet and the companions and the Khulafa al-Rashidun, but also the sunnah of the imams of the Salaf. And what he means by that is the imams of the Tabi'un who are followed in these various amsar, various towns, including Abu Hanifa. So what's really interesting here is that Abu Hanifa himself, Abu Yusuf, who's an Arab, he's talking to a Khalifa who is from Quraysh, right? And he's telling him that you have to follow the sunnah of Abu Hanifa, who's a Persian and who was a Mawla and he was an outsider, and now he becomes an Imam and he becomes a role model, and because of Islam, right? So you could say that these things are, in many ways, and these madahib now are becoming independent sources of knowledge, and this knowledge, then the fuqaha, the khalifas themselves in the future, after this point, they look to the madahib for help and guidance, and many of them, the Khalifas themselves, in Baghdad, for example, many of them were Hanbali, not Hanafi, for centuries. But again, by this time, they did not rule; they only reigned. They were kind of like the British Queen, or now the King. Their power was limited to symbolic power of a Khalifa. And all this to say that the Hanafi madhab, you cannot say the Hanafi madhab has been in. So Hanafi madhab did not really come to power until the Ottomans. Until that time, the Hanafi madhab is like the rest of the madhab, but they are, you believe your madhab is the best way to understand and apply the Sharia. Therefore, you want your judge to succeed and your laws to be applied. And then when there is, when there are multiple madhahib in one region, in one city, then multiple courts are set up in the same city, right? And this happens in Egypt and Damascus in the time of Baybars, when in Cairo, all four of the madhahib have their courts, and that's a beautiful thing. You have multiple communities that are living together and recognizing. I'm not saying it's perfect, but in this respect, it's a beautiful thing. The problem is with politics. Like, you have to be able to, or the ummatics. What I mean to say here is that if your madhab community, your Hanafi, Shafi'i, Hanbali, and if it's just the intellectual school, you go to college and some people study architecture, other people study geography, other people study sociology, and you may be into Marx, you may be into Hegel, you may be into Rawls or whatever, but you don't become different people, right? I'm just giving you an example from contemporary university, right? But whenever in Islamic history these madhahib become bigger identity than Islam, then they become a problem. So, for example, in Nishapur is an example, 4th century Nishapur. When the Hanafis and Shafi'is, Hanafi-Shafi'i rivalry is legendary in Islamic history. But in Nishapur, they actually go at each other with, to go to blows. They fight, and the city, according to the historians, is destroyed as a result of this conflict between the Hanafis and Shafi'is. Now, arguably, you could say that the real conflict was about status wars, and Shafi'is happened to be one side and Hanafis on the other side. Hanafis were the old guys, Shafi'is were the newcomers. Nevertheless, whatever else other social struggle was taking place, it took the name of Hanafis versus Shafi'is, and those are also examples that show us how things could go wrong. But under those circumstances, when the ulama and the people of knowledge understand that we are one ummah, but when we go to school, we have to master one madhab in order to understand, in order to systematically, because you don't have the ability, no matter how smart you are, to equally master 4 different traditions. And honestly, it's useless. You're going to live with one tradition. Why would you master 4? Unless you are some kind of a genius who's interested in comparativism. But for real life, you need 1, maybe 2, just so that you have some perspective.
Sheikh, that's many of the Islamic movements today. The ayah in the Quran, وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُونَ الْخَيْرَ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ. This is the ayah that many Islamic movements, whether from all backgrounds, used to say that look, first of all, this is the reason why Islamic movements can exist, and that inshallah, when the Khilafah is established, these Islamic movements will continue to be there in order to enjoin the good and forbid the evil. First of all, what is your view on that, on the political movements, Islamic movements, after the establishment of the Khilafah? And second, when you talk about ummatics, are we saying Ummatics is a think tank in some sense that is going to solve the problems that we are discussing as far as unity between the schools? If that becomes an issue, for instance, or what will be the use of Ummatics after the Khilafah is established, and what do you see as the role of political movements that are working for the establishment of the Khilafah, that are working, I guess, their role in the Islamic State when it's established? Both.
Okay, so great question. Two different questions. Yeah. One is the question of Islamic movements, and the other Ummatics. So let me answer the question of Islamic movements first. The Islamic movements are, the name itself in English, or you translate into, from Arabic, Harakat Islamiyya, Al-Harakat, or Tahrikat, in Urdu we would say Islami Tahrik. First of all, the movement for Al-Amr Ma'ruf wa Nahy Munkar is nothing new in history. From the very beginning, you've had groups, people have come together to associate with each other in order to change the status of their community, to bring them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? This is nothing new at all.
Well, did they have names? I'm sorry, I'm cutting you off, but did they have names? Because this is usually not discussed. This is the first time I'm hearing from you. Although, I'm sure there are movements, you have Sassanids and, Al-Murabitun and others. But so there have been movements, you're saying?
Well, now the question is the form of the movement. The form of the movement has to match the people that it is working within. When you have modern societies, large modern societies, where a large number of people are literate, they're able to read, then the form of the movement is going to be different than when people lived mostly as communities and families and tribes, and there the movement, the da'wah, might take the form of an alim with many students, or the ulama networks, or it may take the form of Sufi tariqas, especially for commoners. It may take the form of a jihad movement if the main problem is that you are living, for example, in an area where there is a lot of attacks from the outsiders. Then what you need is, if the main problem is law and order, like, for example, to give you just one example in history, in 11th, 12th, 13th century, let's say 12th, 13th century Anatolia, which is present-day Turkey, before the Mongols came, before the Crusaders came, they were the Seljuk tribes that established themselves there. They conquered Christian. Just give me 1 second, huh?
Go ahead, do it.
Sorry. So, the Seljuks in Anatolia, they established futuwa organizations of young men who are enforcing law and order, because that's what's needed at the time. They are the Islamic movements at the time. Murabitun are on the borders, right? They're tribals. They don't have large sedentary societies. They're tribal people, and so they are an Islamic movement that is taking the form of the society in which it's living. And so when you look closely at Islamic history, you've had groups that have often coalesced around a leader, but the leader could be a political leader with religious charisma. They could be primarily ulama. They could be ulama of madhahib. They could be ulama or tariqas or Sufis. All of these orders, all of these things existed. So contemporary 20th century, something new happens for the first time. first time in history, in human history, which is that a large number of people now know how to read and write, and they're not living as tribes or families in close communities, but they're living as a large society. So a new thing is what we're called society. Society is different from a community. Community is like people that you know, and a small grouping of people that are usually brought together by either some lineage or trade or something. Society is large and complex and diverse, and is brought together by this new thing called a nation state, or the new state that is born. And large number of people are educated in this. They're literate. And a large number of people in the Muslim world, they have the additional problem that they're educated in these new secular institutions, whereas people used to be, so if you look at the society, say, a century before this moment, most Muslims, numerically are not literate. Most people go through kutab, madrasas for children, and after that they go into their particular trade. And some of them go and become ulama, particularly certain families that continue this knowledge. And they are maybe 5% or 10% of the total population. There's more in cities, less in the rural areas, but that's what society looks like, right? You have a few people who are into books, and the people that are reading books, writing books, are a small class. It's not possible for a large number of people to dedicate themselves to reading and writing because they don't have the resources for it. And so one thing that's happening in the 19th century, that is late 1800s, is the establishment of mass public education. It's happening in the Ottoman Empire, it's happening in other colonized places, and that continues throughout the early 20th century. As a result of that, you have a new kind of person born, a new class of people is born whose number is increasing. That's the middle class. People who are not ulama by training, but they are not peasants who don't know how to read and write either. They are in between, and they have secular knowledge. When I say secular knowledge, I don't mean necessarily anti-religious knowledge, but they have knowledge of the world. They are able to read books. And as that is happening, a new challenge is born for Islam. The old ulama are used to talking to either their fellows in the language that is Greek to ordinary people, or they talk to the ordinary people, tell them, do X, don't do Y, because that's all they can understand. But now all of a sudden you have middle knowledge that's needed, which is now you have to tell people not only do X and do Y, but you have to give reasons, and you have to tell them how is this new knowledge going to work in the modern society, and then so on and so forth. Now, this new situation leads to a massive number of people throughout Muslim world who are now looking for books to read, and they have to respond to the attack of secular materialist ideas from the West. Now, because Muslims have been defeated politically, there is a massive inferiority complex. So somebody has to go out to the people and tell them how great Islam is, how great Islam's past was, how great Islam's the Sharia wisdom is. But you cannot write books about in the old lingo of complex language, but rather you have to talk to people in ordinary language, right? And it's a very similar problem that we have. Academics talk in a certain way that ordinary people don't understand, don't care about. And academics themselves, as a result, become, limited to their own silos. And then sometimes, academics are forced to go out and talk, like you are asking me to do. This is happening to the ulama, and this is where Islamic movements in the 20th century, right, 1900s, especially after the abolition of the Khilafah, they have a challenge. Before the abolition of the Khilafah, it's enough that the ulama publish magazines and give speeches and they're okay. But after the abolition of Khilafah, the Ummah feels orphaned. So now you have many of these movements that are born, of course, 1929, Ikhwan al-Ikhwan, Ikhwan Muslimun, 1950s, Hizb al-Tahrir, 1940s, Jamaat Islami in Pakistan, or in India rather, or in South Asia, which then these movements are repeated everywhere, every one of the 50 Muslim countries, because there's a great need for it. And many of the ulama joined these movements. And many of the, even the movements that are considered traditionalists, including Deobandi, they are not timeless movements. They are really movements of ulama, but they are from the 19th century. So their concerns are slightly different. 20th century movements are dealing with the problem of decolonialism and with politics, whereas 19th century, the world is still an old world in which the problem is still how to preserve the old knowledge and prepare new students. So I see movements, what I call, we call Islamic movements, throughout Islamic history, according to the need and the form.
Wow, this is Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. We'll take some questions here, but there's we're gonna have to make part 2, Sheikh. Let me just take a few questions that are coming online. Go ahead, Sheikh, Brother Zain. Number 1 from Abdul Rahman. Can you please discuss briefly the discourse regarding authority during the colonial era? It's a great question.
The question is a little bit vague, so I'm going to give it a meaning that I think it's being asked is that you have, for example, in India, the British come take power. The ulama disagree whether they should join the anti-colonial movement to overthrow British authority, and or they should focus on building, accept the British authority and focus on, let's say, purity of rituals and to make sure that they can continue their private or communal Muslim life. This is a debate that's going on. This is a debate that divides along the lines of what we, in the 19th century, late 19th, 20th century becomes the Deobandi and Barelvi debate. The Deobandi, some of the leading Deobandi scholars are on the side of wanting to strengthen the Khilafah, restore the Khilafah, get rid of the British. And for that purpose, some people went so far as to make common cause with the Hindus against the British. Right? So now the question is, how do you retain Islamic authority? The answer they give is that you need the Khilafah, and to restore or maintain the Khilafah, you need to join hands with even non-Muslims at home against the powerful non-Muslim force that has taken our authority and displaced Muslims and taken away the rule of the Sharia and effectively turned India into Dar al-Kufr according to the Hanafi definition. So
that's an occupation issue.
Yes, that's the colonial era. That's the question, right?
Right, that's the question. But you said something important, Sheikh. Does occupation? Never mind. Go ahead, because I don't want. That's going to take time to answer. But is there another question, Sheikh?
I can come back to the question of occupation later. How about that?
Yes, because there is you start. I mean, that's a discussion we have to have because the rulings during the occupation here. But go ahead, Sheikh. Let me go ahead. Put that question.
So to complete then this idea that some of the ulama So the Deobandi ulama are pro, some of them are, many of the significant ones, the leading ulama are pro Khilafah, and they are worried about, if you will, restoring Islamic rule, politically
If there
Islamic
is
rule.
occupation, if there is an occupation, does it become Darul Kufr or Darul Harb by default, even though the majority are Muslims? Oh, I guess because if the ruling is gone, then it becomes Darul Harb.
So in the Hanafi definition, there are certain requirements, but the main requirement is the rule of Sharia.
Okay, once that's gone, then occupation means Darul Harb.
Well, the ulama, so this is a very complex debate. There's a question of how something becomes from Darul Kufr to Darul Islam, and then there is a debate of how it becomes from Darul Islam to Darul Kufr, and whether sometimes the ulama even dispute whether anything ever becomes Darul Kufr. It could be only considered occupied Darul Islam.
Meaning when there was a Sharia there.
No, even if let's say the Sharia is displaced, some of the ulama say that it becomes Darul Kufr and you should make hijrah, and others say that no, it is Darul Islam that is occupied, and if you can free it, you should free it. So the concerns of the jurists is always the fundamental concern is always clear, which is that Darul Islam should be stable, Darul Islam should expand, and it should not contract. So you should not name a country, a region, or a land that is occupied by the kuffar. You just say, oh, now it's Darul Kufr, I will leave, and khalas, I give up. No. The ulama do not want you to do that. So that on that, there is a debate on what is better policy.
Sheikh,
the role of all the ulama is the same, but the Shafi'is and are strictest in not allowing a land to ever become Darul Kufr. Like if it's something Darul Islam, it can never become Darul Kufr again. But the debate and the conditions I'm not going to go into here. But my point on the question of authority was that some of the ulama, even back then, right, in the early 20th century, were saying that by allying yourself to the Hindus, you're compromising your Islam more. Let the British rule, and let us make sure that our Muslim community is pure. This was the argument of Ahmad Raza Khan Barelvi. So forget about politics and think about communal piety, communal rituals. Make sure that the Hindu, you're not friends with Hindus. Just make sure you can do your salah, make sure you can do your dhikr, make sure you can have the communal arrangement that you want. So some scholars went in that direction and others went in the other direction. I'm not saying who was right or wrong, simply I'm saying this was the debate among the South Asian ulama.
Next question. Go ahead, brother. What are some examples of successful revival movements in Islamic history? Do they have shared framework or do they embark based on the need of the time?
There's a very simple answer. If they do not look at the need of the time, they're irrelevant. And the need of the time can be greatly different. But the shared framework is, from the beginning, is they're going back to the Quran and the Sunnah. So, and some of the ulama say that the first revival, the very first revival happened in this ummah at the moment that Rasulullah passed away and people did not know what to do. And Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh said, the Prophet has not died, he will come back, and so on. And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh stood up and said, وَمَا مُحَمَّدٌ إِلَّا رَسُولٌ قَدْ خَلَتْ مِنْ قَبْلِهَا الرُّسُلُ أَفَإِنْ مَاتَ أَوْ قُتِلَ انقَلَبْتُمْ عَلَىٰ أَعْقَابِكُمْ. When he read this ayah until the end, that is when Umar ibn al-Khattab said, when he heard this ayah, it is as if he heard it the first time, even though it's in the Quran for 8 years and he knew it. But it is as if he heard the ayah for the first time, that the Quran had talked about the death of the Prophet ﷺ and what will happen after that, which means that this is an example of revival. What does every revivalist movement that is true? You can have revival that is misguided. That's not revival. That's distortion and further decline. But often you don't know the difference between them until you're able to evaluate, right? But the true revivalist movement is one that goes back and revives a sunnah or an understanding of the Quran, understanding of an ayah that has been lost, some meaning of Islam that has been lost. And as soon as it becomes clear to Ahlul Ilm, it becomes clear that this is what we need. So the whole Ummah and all the good people of the Ummah come together. Like what we are seeing, for example, in Gaza. Once the two sides come together and you're seeing, you cannot be deceived by the media and by your rulers, because you have TikTok and YouTube and Insta and Facebook, and you're able to see what's happening. The entire Ummah wakes up and realizes there is very, very, very few exceptions, because al-haq becomes so clear, right? So this is an example of revival that is taking place in the Ummah. There are many such revivals throughout history.
Sheikh, we have, let's say, another 5 minutes here. I know it's been already since 7 o'clock. Sheikh, you mentioned Ibn Taymiyyah here, and then you also mentioned Abu Hanifa. Has there been difference ever between, are there ulama who have been just academics, and then there were ulama who were very politically astute, or they were activist ulama. Let's call them activist ulama. And again, Ibn Taymiyyah comes to mind, Abu Hanifa comes to mind, and also Imam Shafi'i. But do you is there a difference in how they respond to things, Sheikh? An activist alim or an academic? Because when we think about Ibn Taymiyyah, there were many scholars there, but he is responding. He's responding to the need of the time. He is standing up in front. He's actually even putting together an army to the point that even the ruler in the area thinks that he may even want to take power. How does that happen, Sheikh? Why does Ibn Taymiyyah become this type of a scholar, and others take more maybe academic to a back, the step back approach type of
thing? So, of course, ذَلِكَ فَضْلُ اللَّهِ يُؤْتِيهِ مَن يَشَاءُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses different people for different types of good, and you have many ulama in Islam, particularly in the early period, who would fit your classification of the activist ulama, because until the 4th century, being an alim did not give you a job. So knowledge was, you could say, in time of Abu Hanifa, Malik, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Shafi'i, all of them had a business or something else they did in order to make money. They weren't paid for what they did. But then what begins to happen as the institution of the madrasa is born in the 4th century, 4th century of Hijrah, in Iran or Central Asia somewhere, and then from there it spreads. And then rulers, new types of rulers, Salatin, that come to power, and it's not a bad development or a good development, it's just historical development, institutional development. And law, madhab, that is Islamic law, Sharia, becomes an important element of the society. Before that, it is diffused in the society. The ulama, the sahaba, the tabi'un, they have this knowledge and they're teaching and so on. And anybody who goes, you could say that before that, knowledge is much more organic, and then around 4th century and onward, knowledge becomes more formalized, and you could say built into a curriculum that is taught according to one of these several madahib. And if you are a ruler who comes from outside, who want to rule the society, one way to rule effectively, and one way to be accepted by the people, and one way to insert yourself into the society and be important is by sponsoring a madrasa, by giving salary to these scholars, right? Now, these scholars, like myself, like, I get paid, I'm at a public university that allows me to develop knowledge. Right? That's what public professors do. There is a downside to that, although I criticize American government all the time. So just because my salary comes from a source does not mean I'm beholden to it. Of course, certain laws and rights and regulations allow me this freedom so that if I say something against the government, they can't punish me. That is a measure of freedom that I should be given. You have all of these things under different labels in Islam, in Islamic society. So just because these ulama are salaried doesn't mean that they are scholar for the dollar, if you will. They are great pious ulama who are developing knowledge, and they share with the rulers the shared goal of Islam, of governing by Islam, living by Islam. Sometimes rulers are more pious than the ulama. So we often think of the rulers as, routinely bad and impious and ignorant. That's often the case. It's almost become a stereotype. But that's not always the case, and there are very important exceptions. Sometimes the rulers become very pious and of these ulama, and they genuinely invest. And sometimes they are trying to manipulate the ulama by paying them. All of these examples exist. So that said, as more ulama become part of a salaried class, they become more and more like professors. They become categorically a different class of people than the ones that are making jihad. The people that are making jihad, or maybe even they're not making jihad, they are just conquerors interested in booty and whatnot. Those are warriors, and they are usually coming from the outside. They're not sometimes even speaking Arabic. And it takes time for example, there are waves and waves of Central Asian horse warriors. At first, the Seljuks come, then the different kinds of Turks, and then the Mongols come, and then after that, the Mamluks import from Central Asia and Circassia. So you have many of these warriors that are a different class than the people that they're ruling. The ulama are a different class. However, their children and children's children assimilate into the society, and they become the ulama, and they become like the rest, but it takes time. So there is a problem, which is that if all you do is learn ilm, and you don't learn fighting, or if your fighting skills are like my gun-toting skills, I cannot go fight in a war. I can fire a gun. So if you know sword fighting like that, that's no good. But then you could say there is some other issues that we don't have time to go into, such as military technology. When the horse warriors begin to come from the north, they could fight from the back of a horse. That's a skill that requires 20 years to learn. Sword fighting takes 2 years to learn. So when those this elite soldiers come into play, then basically the ulama are out of business. Very few people can have both the skill of that kind and be able to fight and be able to focus on their academics. So basically, you could say this is a material change that the amount of time it takes for you to become a warrior is so great that these people have to become two different classes. And then there are exceptions, like Ibn Taymiyyah is an example, and there are some other ulama. Often they would be born, ulama like that are an exception because they may have seen something like Ibn Taymiyyah when he was only 6. He had to leave Harran because of the Mongol attacks, and so basically he saw the need for jihad and the vulnerability of Muslims, and he saw what had happened to Muslims at the hands of the Mongols. The other thing about Ibn Taymiyyah that's exceptional is that how well informed he is about the politics of his time. Most ulama did not have the time or acumen to do that. He interviews the Mongol commanders, so he knows about what the Mongols really are at a time when Muslims generally do not know, and the ulama do not know who these people are. They claim to be Muslims. What is their Islam? What is their ideology? Why are they fighting? How do they live? Like all of these things that Ibn Taymiyyah talks about in detail, because he actually went to the camps where they were camped and argues with them, talks to them, figures out what they are. And much of that knowledge now we can historically ascertain what he was saying was true, but at that time it was not known generally to the ulama, because you don't have academic, you don't have academies that are studying world affairs. So you could say this is a vacuum in Islamic societies, right? You don't have academies that are studying social issues, threats, political issues. And I mean, of course, I'm giving anachronistic critique, meaning I'm talking based on modern experience and projecting it back. But there is something to it. I'm not going to go too much into it, but basically you could say there are social reasons why the ulama come to occupy certain styles of life.
I don't know. Sheikh, we have reached 2 hours mark. I didn't even realize this. MashaAllah, tabarakallah. I didn't even realize we reached 2 hours mark. Wallahi, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless and accept it from you, Sheikhi. Again, brothers and sisters, this is the book. I really seriously recommend the book. You need to read it. We will put it up, even online or on our page. And we need to support this kind of work. This is some, amazing work that the ulama are putting out there. Sheikh Dr. Ovamir, Jazakallah khair for coming on the show. I almost want to ask you, can we discuss this actual book in detail one time on the show? Because, I mean, it is that good. And it really, mashallah, tabarakallah. So, Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. Any last thoughts that you would like to give before we end the show?
I invite all Muslims, especially talabat al-ilm, people who are interested in the sacred knowledge, to believe, to consider their talab al-ilm as a service for the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to think of themselves as part of this Ummatics struggle, Ummatics movement, even if all you're doing is is teaching or learning, or you're interested only in tajweed, or you're only in fiqh. All of these are necessary sciences. They make up our deen, and they should not be opposed to the struggle for the independence of the ummah, the defense of the ummah, the defense of the mustad'afin, because you cannot be a talib al-ilm and ignore the ayat of the Quran that talk about the defense of the ummah. And you cannot say that my job stops only at talab al-ilm or teaching or the imam, that I will be inshallah, or I will be. No, the entire ummah will be a problem. And you have to think of your door to this fortress of Islam. You will guard one door, but open your heart and your dua and your thinking and your support to other people who are doing other types of work. And the same thing I will say to people who consider themselves activists or du'at, that you could not do what you're doing if the ulama and tulab al-ilm were not writing their books and teaching and preparing. So Gaza today would not have happened if you did not have Quran teachers. There were institutes of Quranic studies. This is one of the, as you know, one of the most concentrated areas where huffaz, memorizing the Quran,
at the time are actually resisting. Many of them are huffaz.
So you can see the character of their resistance because of the work that the ulama and tulab al-ilm have done for centuries for conveying this knowledge of the Quran. And you can see how the two come together so perfectly, so that when that, I'm sure you have seen that clip where this shaheed, may Allah accept him and may Allah give each one of us shahada. As the Rasulullah says in Sahih Muslim, whoever dies and doesn't participate in this or doesn't even have desire, that person dies in a shu'bah of nifaq, in a type of nifaq. So may Allah not make us among those. But you have to, when you're doing your talab al-ilm, you have to also keep in mind what is your heart in this struggle for the ummah. Those are not two different things, they are one thing. May Allah give us tawfiq and bring honor and protection to this ummah back again.
I I don't want to say anything else. That was the best closing that we can have. Brothers and sisters, Jazakumullah khairan for attending and for watching. And inshallah, we will see you guys next week, Friday. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Salam alaikum.
لا لن يطول الظلام، ديننا لن يضام، نحن جيل الهمام، نحن فينا عمر. لا 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 لن يطول الظلام، ديننا لن يضام، نحن جيل الهمام، نحن فينا عمر. صبح بدا نور ظهر، نجم وشمس وقمر، ألقى على الدنيا الدرر. هذا عمر، هذا عمر، كل البرايا تنتظر أيامه البيض الغرر كي تستفيد من العبر. هذا عمر، هذا عمر. لا لن تدوم الجراح، بل سيأتي الصباح، نحن أهل الكفاح، نحن فينا عمر. لا لن تدوم الجراح، بل سيأتي الصباح، نحن أهل الكفاح.